All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Youngwoo. I was part of the UADC 2023 Adjudication Core 2 years ago. And I was asked by this year's UADC Core if I can do a motion debrief among the motions that I made for the tournament. And I chose the Open Grand Finals motion, which reads, under the veil of ignorance, this house as an individual would choose to be born in a religious community with a strong communal values as opposed to secular society. I chose this motion for two reasons. The first is I think this motion combines a lot of elements together. So there's a broad discussion about religion, but also it has strong element of philosophical debate, but also it still has a twist of veil of ignorance. And I think that that means that the clash that can be generated in the round encompasses pretty diverse scope of issues. So that's the first reason why I chose this motion. But the second one is that this one has a recording that is available on YouTube. So after watching this workshop, if you want to have a reference or look at how the round actually happened, like I'd also encourage you to watch the round. It's pretty good. It was a pretty good finals. All right, so I'm gonna address three things in this workshop. Firstly, I'm gonna explain the thought process I had behind making this motion. Secondly, I'll address what I think are broadly the case for government and opposition. I'm not gonna go into like a very detailed like explanation on what the arguments are going to be and what mechanisms debaters can use because I think that's a bit prescriptive. But additionally, as I've explained, there's a recording available. So there I'm going to mostly talk about the broad direction of the case and some of the strategies that I think can be clever both in this motion but also in a similar motions. And then the final thing I want to address is the specifics of the motion. So how this motion may perhaps be different from general debates about whether or not we like religion. Um, okay, so to explain the thought process, so the initial wording of the motion, if I'm remembering correctly, um, actually, I'm pretty sure that this is not the correct initial wording, but it was somewhere along the lines of religious community with an egalitarian structure. So the italicized, you know, part of the motion is where we have revised. So just kind of explaining what the intention was for the egalitarian structure. So what I tried to imply initially in that motion is that government side is defending a world where you are born in a community with small, more equal, where everyone is kind of performing a similar role. Um, and consequently, that probably means that the community is more smaller, more close-knit. So that kind of world versus just secular society. Um, but the reason why we changed the wording to the one that was final version is because we felt that egalitarian structure does give the government side a pretty powerful argument that they get to claim that the society is going to be egalitarian. So that's why we changed the wording to a community with a strong communal value. Um, but also, I think that the final wording still leads the debate into that direction where government can give some mechanisms to explain why that community is likely to be more equal or egalitarian, but still leaving it up to debate for the opposition side to contest. So um, the revision of the wording improved, I think, the balance for opposition side, but also leave it up to leave it up to the debate how egalitarian or hierarchical the community would be on government. But essentially, as I've explained, the intention was to compare a more equal, close-knit, but irreligious community, where some norms around dogma might exist, and versus secular society with a wider variation. This motion, I think, includes general debate about whether we like religion. So, a lot of similar motions exist in terms of like, assuming you're a scientist who have found an infallible information that religion does not exist. Like, do you disclose that information or not? Like, it, you know, similar variations of motions exist. So I think that this motion includes a lot of those kind of general and more stock debate about whether we like religion. But I think that there are two twists to this. The first of which is that um, it is kind of comparing two different sets of community. And the religious community that is kind of alluded to in the motion is the one that is more smaller, more traditional, and perhaps more remote. If I'm remembering correctly, the government team in that finals used examples like Amish community, which I think was kind of aligned with what I was intending. So I think that that does bring some degree of specificity. But additionally, I think that the veil of ignorance emphasizes risk aversion. So for those of you who may not know what veil of ignorance is, it's a philosophical concept that assumes that under the veil of ignorance, you don't know your identity, you don't know what economic or social position you're going to be born into. You don't know if you're going to be poor, you don't know if you're going to be women, you don't know if you're going to be like a member of a specific racial group, and so on. So, not knowing any of these things probably kind of emphasizes risk aversion. So, you want to make sure that the worst of case scenario of like being born in a society without an identity that you will be persecuted for, like you want to minimize the risk or you want to hedge against the risk. Um, so I think that there's an element about risk aversion and which side is better able to avoid the worst case scenario for an individual. And obviously, what constitutes the worst case scenario for an individual is definitionally also up to debate. But I think that adds a layer of complexity. So that was the thought process behind the motion. All right, so what do I think is the general case line from the government side? The first thing is, as I've explained, because you're unsure about your identity, social position, and so on, you want to say that risk minimization is important. And I guess as a layer of preemption against the opposition team who might say something along the lines of, like religion oftentimes like kind of homogenizes people, like it kind of subsumes every identity of individuals. Like everyone is sort of subject to the same authority and control. So there is very little room for agency. I think that government can, to an extent, try to mitigate this by saying that even within that community, there will be different groups that represent different groups' interests. So for example, there could be interest group that represent specific jobs, specific roles within religious community, specific neighborhood and geographic location. So I think you can say that even if you're talking about smaller and close-knit community where everyone believes in the same religion, there is some room for diversity to be respected. Obviously, maybe not to the extent of secular society, but I think you can say, or you can try to preempt the potential argument for opposition by doing this kind of setup. The next thing you want to consider is how religion provides a sense of meaning. And here you might want to first emphasize why people living in a secular society more often than not live a very unfulfilling life. I think there are many intuitive reasons that I think we can think of, such as, for example, how capitalism and competitive environment makes people feel unfulfilled. Oftentimes, people are, you know, doing dead end 9 to 5 job, especially if you are, coming from a relatively disadvantaged position where you're doing job that is more low skilled, that have very little chance of promotion and so on. So I think you can say that there are many reasons why people living in secular society do live pretty unfulfilling life, which obviously is not immediately solved just by being born in a religious community, but you can say that religion at least mitigates the kind of like hedonic treadmill and so on. So for example, things like religion, gives you or usually has this doctrine where it tells believers that they're doing good things and they're going to go to heaven at the point in which they're practicing what they're told to, and this gives them sense of meaning even while they're doing a menial task. I think additionally, the nuance that government can add here is probably somewhere along the lines of like, um, it needs to be a community because you have one another to affirm each other, versus if you are religious in a secular society, probably you don't really have a lot of community to fall back to. So I think you can try to explain how religion interacts with you as an individual and the way in which you construct meaning, but also additionally explain why the like kind of the community having a common religion is oftentimes a source of better support structure to magnify the benefit of individual fulfillment. The final thing you want to talk about from government is probably about why the structure of this community is more likely to be egalitarian. So one mechanism potentially something like the smaller the size of the community is, this means that each member's contribution becomes more important for the sustainability of that community, which probably means that each members are more likely to be seen and heard. You might want to talk about things like your neighbors also kind of depending on you helping them, or you also want to talk about the ways in which religious leaders in these communities would probably try to be inclusive in order to make sure that, people are actually feeling included and people do adhere to religion. Um, and then obviously this kind of thing doesn't exist in secular society where it's more individualistic and where everyone is kind of competing against each other and so on. Okay, so what is the opposition case? So I think if I were opposition, I might try with a sense check, by kind of asking an intuition or invoking a question by saying things like, well, is it really true that the most secular societies are drudging and miserable as government side is arguing? And obviously this is not an analysis in and of itself, but like obviously insofar as some judges in the panel are like either secular or they are religious in like less like at least they're not really living in the Amish community, then probably like you can kind of like hit the intuition of the judge to be like, well, we live in secular societies. Are we really, living a very unfulfilling life as what the government side describes? So I think that's probably a good way of explaining or kind of invoking intuition from the outset. You might want to say that secular societies have problems improving. There is actually a more motivation for secular societies to improve because there is constant sense of self-reflection and aiming for a better versus religious societies where people are a little bit more content and probably may display some degree of path dependency. I would also probably say that opposition might try to co-opt government to a certain extent by saying that, well, there are non-religious, immaterial ways of fulfillment like family, culture, and so on. So it is not true that people only derive meaning from like capitalism and how much money they earn, but oftentimes they can feel fulfillment through, having a good relationship with their family or, through their culture, which is not necessarily religion. Um, the next thing you can argue, or the direction that you might want to consider from opposition, is why religious form of meaning is often bad. So here is where you can invoke the analysis of sometimes religion has very strict moral norms that are often exclusionary and fear-inducing because you have to fear about going to hell if you don't abide by those religious rules. And especially where the more dominant religion is, as per the motion implies, that probably means that there's less leniency. So, like, I guess in more secular society, it's okay if you're a Christian and you still drink, but probably that's not the case, or that's not the social norm in the community of government side. So, you might want to say that oftentimes this form of meaning is often very restrictive. It inhibits your self-actualization and things like that. So the key there is to explain why religious doctrines likely impede believers from feeling fulfilled. Also, you might want to say that to succeed as a religious person, the bar of that might be also high. So you have to, for example, donate a lot of money to the institution and community. And because you're under the veil of ignorance, you actually are not sure if you have that capacity to be able to fulfill those kind of requirements. obviously the government side can contest this by saying that, well, even if you are disadvantaged, the religion doesn't really require you to donate as much in comparison to the rich people. But I think that it's really up to the how teams explain the likelihood analysis there. The final thing that you can say from the opposition side is to point to some series of flaws that religious communities potentially can have. So, for example, this could be something like, religious communities are not democratic. The leaders are often just religious authorities that are not elected through popular referendum. This means that there is not a lot of accountability to make sure that leaders are acting in the interest of the members. The nuance here that you should employ is probably government side is going to say the inverse is true, where religious authorities also have altruistic incentive. Then you might want to say firstly that there is more likelihood for the leader to be non-altruistic than altruistic. But additionally, even if we believe that some isolated cases of religious communities may have good leaders, but so long as this is a veil of ignorance motion, we need to hedge against a risk. And then you might want to explain why being born in a community with a restrictive leader actually is very, very damaging, such that avoiding that risk ought to be prioritized over other considerations. Okay, so finally, some specifics of the motion. I think I've already kind of dealt with this, but veil of ignorance, I think, adds in this layer. So, one of the things that I thought when I was making the motion is secular societies kind of have more wider variation than religious communities, in that secular societies include strong democracy that have like robust social welfare, but it might as well also be true that there are set of secular societies that are also deprived of resources, where there are political corruptions and have exclusionary social culture, something that is unfortunately rising in many Western secular societies as well. Um, so the key here, I think, is religious communities are probably not as good as the former. Like, if we assume the best case of secular society, probably religious communities aren't going to be as liberating because it still has some like pretty strong degree of social norm. But it's arguably better than the latter. So it is better to be born in a religious community than being born in a secular society that has like widespread corruption and social conflict and so on. Although I say this is still contestable. So if there is a wider variation within secular society, some of which could be better than religious communities, some of which could be worse than religious community, the key, I think, that falls under both teams is to explain, firstly, why most secular societies fall under one range of characteristics. So if you are government, you might want to say, well, actually, vast majority of secular societies, in fact, fall under the latter kind of characterization. And if you're opposition, you want to prove the converse, given that it's just speculative in terms of like which community you're likely to be born into. But the second thing is you might want to kind of talk about what exactly are the risks that you want to hedge against. And this is what I think makes this motion a bit different than just this house prefers religious community over secular society, in a sense that because you don't know what your identity is going to be, you don't know if you're going to be, a gender minority, racial minority, or if you don't know if you're going to be poor and so on. So obviously being disadvantaged gives you some like inconvenience, or you're likely to experience discrimination on both sides of the bench to a certain extent, then you might want to think of like how discrimination differs according to the religiosity of the context, and how does that shape the disadvantage that people have? Why does that mean that being born in one society is actually better than the other? I think there's a bit of a nuance thing to do there. The final thing is I think just by the virtue of veil of ignorance, there's a lot of speculative elements, which means that I think the thing you should care more about in this debate is probably doing a lot of mechanization and weighing work, which is like obviously true for any debate. But I think particularly um, because all judges probably also have different conception of secular society or religious communities, trying to supply a lot of granular analysis on why your characterization is more likely than the other team is probably a key in not only this motion, but in a veil of ignorance debate or in any debate that has pretty strong speculative dimension. Okay, so I think that's it for this workshop. I hope you enjoyed. I would also encourage you to watch the recording on the YouTube, and good luck for those competing at UADC.